Israel is in the grip of a political storm that has lasted months and shows no signs of resolution. This was President Isaac Herzog speaking in March.
The last couple of weeks have been tearing us apart. Anyone who thinks that a real civil war of human life is a line that we will not reach has no idea. The abyss is within touching distance.
The president has historically held a symbolic and ceremonial role. So for him to come out and address the Israeli public in this way just shows how a lot of people really feel that the country is at a crossroads where people are fighting over what the future of the state could look like.
So the president was speaking after protests flared in response to the government's plan to pass a judicial overhaul.
These are my colleagues Shana Oppenheimer and Joel Greenberg, who watch and analyze Israel through its media for BBC Monitoring.
The prime minister later put the reforms on hold to allow for compromise talks, but those negotiations broke down. The government has now resumed work in parliament on the overhaul, and the protesters have stepped up their protests considerably. There was one interesting twist recently when Netanyahu told a foreign newspaper a key element of the overhaul would be shelved, but it's not at all clear what that means, and this crisis is far from over.
In this week's Global Jigsaw, we look at the crisis in Israel for a glimpse of the ideas and forces deeply dividing Israelis today. I'm Krassi Twig, and this is the Global Jigsaw, an original podcast from BBC Monitoring, zooming in on political, security and social shifts around the world through the lens of its media. Our team listens to, watches and analyzes media narratives in 100 languages.
Radio Tehran.
Right, we must go now to Moscow.
Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
I mean, have you got any thoughts on that?
The anti-government protests are taking place every Saturday in cities across Israel. So the main protests are in Tel Aviv. You also have quite a large number of people gathering in Jerusalem. But even if you just drive on the highway on a Saturday evening, on so many overpasses, you see people gathered with banners and cars honking in support of the protests.
Looking at drone footage of the protests, you really get a feel for how huge they are.
There are a large variety of people. You have the majority of people who feel that their rights are at stake and that the future of what the country is going towards is at stake. But then you have people in support of LGBTQ rights. You have people in support of Palestinian rights, people who are there protesting against the occupation. You have ultra-Orthodox people, though it's small and marginal. You have some settlers, though it's small and marginal. And then you also have this group of women who are wearing red robes, dressed like people from Handmaid's Tale. It's this really chilling and dystopian warning that we've seen all over the world in different protest movements. And there have already been attempts in Israel coming from the ultra-Orthodox community and religious parties in the coalition to limit the role of women and to segregate public events by gender. So these women really feel that without a court system that would uphold their rights, anything can happen.
In the last few years, Israel has had inconclusive elections, which led to unstable coalitions or political deadlock. The country's longest-serving Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who leads the right-wing Likud party, lost power after an election in 2021. Last November's vote returned him to office. But this time, something in the state of Israel shifted. This is a story that the whole world is covering. I asked Joel, what does BBC Monitoring bring to it?
We're capturing the Israeli conversation on this, the debate in Israel from Israeli sources. In other words, how Israeli commentators and reporters reporting and describing what's going on and also arguing about it and debating it. And I think that's a unique perspective that you really only get from reading the local media in the language itself, and we'll look from within at how this story, which has really become an international story, is perceived by Israelis and Israeli analysts.
Let's start with a brief overview of what's happened in Israel since the elections in November 2022.
Well, the election put in power the most right-wing religious conservative government in Israel's history. So it set up a kind of a confrontation with about half of the country. And of course, this was exacerbated when the government decided to move forward on what it calls judicial reform. Others will say judicial overhaul. The opponents call it a judicial coup. It's a process in which they want to change the way the justice system operates, most importantly, curtailing the powers of the Supreme Court. So this has become the key issue. And this triggered massive protests across the country. They snowballed into a very large protest movement, which has brought out many people who normally would not be out demonstrating on other issues. We have week after week tens of thousands of people taking to the streets. So in terms of a sustained national protest movement, this has not happened previously.
This government includes hardline ultra-nationalists from parties with names such as Religious Zionism and Jewish Power, and some controversial individuals. But as Joel explained, the lightning rod for the huge protests is the proposed overhaul of the judicial system. Time for one of our fact files. Here, with some more details of what the government is trying to do, is Dan Adula from our Jerusalem team.
Israel has 13 basic laws, which set out the formation and role of the main state institutions, and also protect some civil rights. The laws were intended to be draft chapters of a constitution, and some can only be changed by a supermajority of the Knesset, Israel's parliament. But they did not initially establish the principle of judicial review. That changed after two basic laws relating to human rights were passed in 1992. Which the Supreme Court interpreted as giving it the power to review and strike down incompatible legislation. As in other countries such as the US, where Supreme Courts have this power, governments can be unhappy when this happens, and for this reason, there has been a long campaign against so-called judicial activism in Israel. As just two examples of decisions that have angered some people in Israel, in 2020, the Supreme Court struck down a law that had retroactively legalized about 4,000 settler homes built on privately owned Palestinian land in the West Bank. In January this year, the court ruled that Aryeh Deri, head of the ultra-Orthodox Shas party and a key coalition partner of Netanyahu, could not be appointed to a cabinet post because of past criminal convictions. The current government has said it wants to introduce an override clause to allow Parliament to reenact laws struck down by the Supreme Court, although whether this clause will continue to be pursued is now unclear. Other proposed changes include giving the government a decisive say in the appointment of judges and barring the court from striking down government decisions and appointments as unreasonable. Israel's parliament only has one assembly, the elected Knesset, in which the ruling coalition has a majority and there is no second chamber, leaving the Supreme Court as a critical check on government policies.
Opponents of these proposed judicial changes say the policy is partly motivated by Netanyahu's personal legal problems. Can you explain what they mean?
Yeah, these critics say that Netanyahu's motive in these judicial changes is to escape conviction in his corruption trial, and that he's hoping somehow his case will be bumped up to the Supreme Court, and by then judges will be appointed more sympathetic to him, and that he will evade any possible jail time or any final sentencing in his trial.
The Prime Minister has consistently denied any wrongdoing, accusing his opponents of a political witch hunt. But his position on the judicial system has undergone a change in the last 10 years.
Yes, in past years, he's spoken publicly about the need for an independent judiciary.
Here's a speech from 2012 that circulated widely earlier this year.
I ask that you show me one dictatorship, one undemocratic society, in which there is a strong and independent judicial system. There is no such thing. That is why I am doing and will continue to do everything in my power to maintain a strong and independent judicial system.
Now he's saying that there's an imbalance, that the Supreme Court has arrogated powers that should be with the government and parliament, and that a balance has to be restored.
Something seems to have changed the Prime Minister's mind. And as Joel was saying, his personal legal troubles are said by critics to be a big factor. But who is actually driving these policies that are attracting so much pushback?
I think it's driven very much by his allies, especially the Justice Minister and the head of Parliament's legal committee. But Netanyahu also, because of his political alliance with them, he has a political need to maintain his support for this change.
What are the concerns that are bringing people out on the streets?
Many of the protesters talk about a dictatorship. They say what the government really wants to do is gain overriding powers to make policy, pass laws with minimal check by the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of concern among the protesters and in the speeches that we hear and in the comments in the press and in the media that the country is sliding toward an authoritarian regime where there is no real check on government policies.
One group of protesters has a specific motivation, the military reservists. And by the way, everyone in Israel has to do military service, apart from Arab Israelis and the ultra-Orthodox.
So the military reservists are fundamentally civilians. They serve only a month or so in the Army Reserve. So they're expressing in many ways the discontent and the protest of ordinary Israelis who are unhappy with these changes. But they also have said if the government curbs the powers of the Supreme Court, then they won't have the protection of Israel's legal system from international tribunals. Israel says that it has an independent judiciary. If it's perceived not to be independent, some of these military reservists fear they'll be exposed to international investigation and possibly prosecution.
This fear is not abstract. In 2021, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court opened an investigation into war crimes allegedly committed by all sides in the occupied territories, going back to 2014. The ICC only prosecutes cases when a country doesn't, won't, or can't do it properly itself. One part of that test is about whether the country has independent judges or not. And it's not just the reservists or people on the left of Israeli politics who object. Here's Moshe Ya'alon, who served as defense minister in a previous Netanyahu government.
I think it's clear that the government's attempt to tamper with the judiciary is illegitimate. Apparently, there is a dictatorial plot here. There is no room for compromise with this government.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. Let's talk about Netanyahu's relationship with the media, which is itself part of his legal case.
Two of the cases that are being heard in this trial have to do with charges that Netanyahu discussed or struck deals with people that the media outlets that they own would provide positive coverage of him and his wife in return for example, regulatory benefits or limiting the circulation of a competing newspaper.
Two prominent media moguls behind the Yediot Ahronot media group and the news website Walla are co-defendants in the Netanyahu corruption trial. They all deny any wrongdoing. Back to Joel with a bit more on the media landscape.
Israel has a very lively media scene. There's a lot of debate, very boisterous debate, both on the pages of the newspapers and in TV studios. Often conversations can degenerate into very loud arguments, very combative, and very freewheeling. Criticism of the government, use of terms that maybe abroad people would be careful about using, are really bandied about here very freely. So the conversation here takes place very openly, and you can see various shades of opinion.
Much of the Israeli media is owned by a handful of the country's wealthiest families and media moguls. All papers are privately owned. There is a popular radio station called IDF Radio, run by the army, but with no apparent government control. And there is a public broadcaster, Kan.
Kan is considered perhaps the most authoritative broadcast source. It's publicly funded either by taxes on Israelis or by government budgets, but is really pretty independent in the content and the programs that it puts out. It has TV and radio. It has a website in Hebrew, Arabic, and it also has digital abilities. It's a very dominant broadcaster, but it has very stiff competition, and in fact the most popular TV news channel is a commercial channel, Channel 12, and there's also Channel 13, another commercial channel. So together they make the three main TV channels, Kan 11, Channel 12, and Channel 13.
As we in monitoring watch the media closely, one media development straight after the election caught our eye. The communications minister threatened to defund Kan, prompting a lot of criticism. The suggestion was withdrawn, and the government appears to have shelved attempts to control the public broadcaster.
Kan reports can be very critical of the prime minister, can be very critical of the government. The correspondents there seem to operate more or less according to their journalistic instincts, and they're not taking instructions. It could be that this minister felt that it was too free and that it needed to be brought more in line with government policy.
Another TV station worth mentioning in the context of the crisis is Channel 14.
So Channel 14 has existed for many years. It was previously called Channel 20, and it was considered by a lot of people as a really fringe channel. In the past few years, we've seen it really grow, and it's been referred to by many people, including the left-wing and centrist media, almost as the Israeli Fox News or Netanyahu's channel. So as a result of these corruption cases, which have really alienated him from some of his former political allies, as well as from most of the mainstream media, Netanyahu has really become a lot closer with this channel in recent years. And we've seen that since his return to power. This is the only channel in Israel that he gives interviews to. And we've seen this channel put out information, some people would say disinformation, about the protests. And over the past few months, we've seen their ratings start to grow, and some of their ratings for their shows have exceeded those for Channel 13.
So this is one part of the media that's clearly aligning with the government in its coverage of this huge story. Another media outlet took a very different approach.
Yes, Haaretz, which is a liberal paper, has gone beyond news reporting and has actually taken a side. They publish a column in which they give schedules and information about upcoming protests. Sometimes this column says what you can do today to fight the judicial coup. There have also been billboards in Tel Aviv that are sponsored by Haaretz that say democracy is not only elections. And so they're actually encouraging Israelis to take part in the demonstrations and the protests on the streets. This is unusual. Other outlets are not doing that. But I think Haaretz has taken a decision that, as they see it, the assault on Israel's judicial system is an assault on democracy, which also involves freedom of the press. And they feel that they're really doing their civic duty by encouraging Israelis to go out and make their opinions known.
As Shana said, the only TV station in Israel that the Prime Minister is talking to is Channel 14. Has Netanyahu commented on the media coverage of the protests?
Prime Minister Netanyahu has often complained about what he calls the mobilized media, which he claims is advocating for the protests, which by and large is not true. The protests are getting very, very wide coverage, and it's considered a major story, which makes sense. But the Prime Minister says that it's being hyped too much by the media. On the other hand, the size of the protest is really something that can't be ignored.
Let's take a look at how social media is reflecting the street protests. Shana is our expert on that.
So WhatsApp is really popular in Israel, and this is where you see a lot of right-wing support for Netanyahu and support for the changes to the judicial system play out. We've seen a lot of disinformation being spread on WhatsApp, as well as calls to attack protesters and calls to attack journalists. Facebook is used a lot by older folks, where you see the more traditional posting of articles, maybe mass messages, videos from protests, or photos. And then we have Twitter, which is mainly used by left-wing circles. And what we've really seen take off is the circulation of videos from the protests, specifically videos that appear to show police violence directed at protesters, and videos of journalists being attacked at rallies for supporters of the overhaul. And then you have Telegram, where you see a lot of armed Palestinian groups as well as settlers use this platform. During campaigns, we've also seen Netanyahu use Telegram, and he's used chatbots to give users a simulated experience of a direct conversation with him. So it's a diverse landscape, but it's also very polarized.
You mentioned attacks on journalists. Is this part of the story?
Attacks on journalists are definitely part of the story, and we've seen that be reported by the left-wing media. Haaretz recently interviewed several reporters who said that they had been physically attacked, pepper-sprayed, and spat at while covering protests. Some of what they're alleging has been caught on camera and shared on social media, and it appears that most of the violence is coming from supporters of the judicial overhaul. But there's also been a few instances where the police are alleged to have been involved.
We did contact the Israeli police for a response to these allegations, but they didn't come back to us. BBC Monitoring's team in Jerusalem also follows Arab Israeli and Palestinian media. How have they been covering the protests and the judicial overhaul debate?
Arab Israeli media have covered this, much like the Hebrew press, as a national story, but Arab Israeli columnists in the Hebrew press have expressed the alienation that many Israeli Arabs feel from the Israeli system. They feel discriminated against, and they have not joined the protests, even though the writers point out that the judicial changes could affect Arab Israelis and Palestinians in the occupied territories. Palestinian media have looked at this as a foreign story, looking very closely at the disarray and crisis in Israel, which they see as an adversary. But we have not seen Palestinian media make the connection between the judicial overhaul in Israel and Israel's policies in the occupied territories.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. Let's dip a toe in the arguments behind the government's controversial proposals. In January, Israel's Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, announced the proposed sweeping reforms to the Israeli judiciary with a lament.
We go to the polls, we vote, we choose, but time and again people we did not choose decide for us. This is not democracy.
A month later, a video surfaced showing Simcha Rothman, the MP responsible for steering the judicial overhaul legislation through the Knesset, giving a speech in 2021.
Democracy is the decision of the majority, the decision of the people. The way to find out what the people want is through the majority.
Is it fair to say that both sides in this crisis frame themselves as the champions of democracy, only with very different conceptions of democracy?
Yes, I think it's fair to say. So the government say that they're the elected majority and that they should be free to pursue the policies that they've been elected to carry out. It's a majoritarian rule. The opponents say that Israel should be a liberal democracy and that the changes the government wants to make will simply give too much power to the majority that the government represents without guaranteeing the rights of minorities and people who oppose the government.
Supreme Court President Justice Esther Hayut took the unusual step of responding directly to Justice Minister Levin in a blunt speech in which she laid out the arguments against simple majority rule.
In recent days, we've heard that the reasoning and justification for the plan is the will of the majority, the decision of the majority. Indeed, majority rule is a fundamental principle, basic to democracy. However, democracy is not only majority rule.
The debate about what democracy means is not new or unique to Israel. In his speech, Rothman also argued for an illiberal democracy and praised Hungary's current government. Shana picked up the reaction in the Israeli media.
We see Simcha Rothman talk about this idea of illiberal democracy, this idea that it's nothing to fear. And we see that in the example of Hungary and Poland, and that has prompted a lot of scholars, not just from Israel, but legal scholars in Hungary and Poland themselves, going on to Israeli media to talk about what happened in their case, to warn about the dangers of going down this road.
The comparisons with Hungary and Poland, the two EU countries widely criticized for going down an illiberal path, have come up at the protests too. Protesters are chanting here, Poland, Hungary, they're not democratic. Opponents of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory have always claimed that Israel is not a fully fledged democracy. I asked Joel whether these arguments were making more headway during the current crisis.
Well, certainly we've seen at the protests people holding up no democracy with occupation. You see the signs, you see the chants. There are groups of anti-occupation protesters and sometimes speakers. But the link between the changes that are trying to be made in the Israeli system and the occupation is not mentioned usually in the mainstream speeches that we're hearing. However, there is a very strong current within the protest movement that says that you really can't demonstrate for democracy if you don't demonstrate for democracy for everyone in areas under Israel's control, not only Israel proper, but also in the occupied Palestinian territories, and that they too have the right to democracy and protection of their individual rights.
The connection between the judicial overhaul and Israeli policies in the occupied Palestinian territories could become clearer if the changes are passed. Netanyahu's allies want to limit the Supreme Court's ability to curb government policies in the West Bank, such as settlement expansion. Since taking office, the government has stepped up approvals of new construction in settlements. According to the Israeli anti-settlement group Peace Now, which monitors such construction, the last 6 months have seen more than 13,000 new settlement homes approved by the government. That's about 3 times as many as in the previous year. Let's get back to the people at the heart of this story, the protesters, with more flavor from Shayna and Joel.
Something that always really caught my eye is the diversity in age, and you actually see a lot of older folks. You see people in wheelchairs and walkers going out and protesting. There's a lot of pride that people have in the Israel that they knew, and they really feel that that could potentially change forever.
Some of the most prominent protests have been by the military reservists as well as by army veterans.
There was a march by a group called Brothers in Arms to Parliament in Jerusalem, and they appear in various protests. One group has a model of a tank that they say they fought with in the 1973 Middle East War. In other words, these are Army veterans and Army reservists who are using their military credentials to give their protest more moral weight among ordinary Israelis. And they're saying they don't want to see the country turned into an authoritarian state or a dictatorship, and that the premise of their service to their country was that it was a democracy, a liberal democracy, not the kind of country that they fear. That's the direction the government is going. There are also many prominent former senior officers in the army who've been very outspoken in the protest, including former army chiefs and very high-ranking generals criticizing Netanyahu and the government for what they say is subverting Israeli democracy. One point that hit home in the protest by the reservists was when groups of them said that they wouldn't report for training.
This should be clear to everyone up there in Jerusalem. There's only reserve duty in a democracy.
And some of these reservists came from very key units, for example, the Air Force, which relies a lot on reserve pilots flying missions. And it's very difficult to fly missions if you're not training all the time. They led the defense minister to warn that if the government proceeds headlong with this overhaul, it would put Israel's security at risk. So this definitely had a lot of impact on the perception of the effect of the demonstrations.
The protests we are discussing have been taking place over many months. Early on, there was a general strike. And as well as the regular Saturday protests, there have also been several so-called days of disruption when roads are blocked. There have also been sizable rallies in support of the government, with one estimated to have attracted 200,000 people. The crowd is chanting, "The people demand judicial reform."
So we've seen at least 2 major rallies in support of the overhaul. And a lot of these people have similar sentiments of the ministers who are really driving this. They feel that the Supreme Court often sides with liberalism. They feel that they are an impediment on their religious, nationalist agenda of focusing on religious school or expanding in the occupied West Bank, for example. They feel that the anti-government protesters are really crying about losing the election. So we're seeing these rallies being organized by different parties that are in the coalition government. We're seeing people being bussed in from settlements. But interestingly, we're also seeing the ultra-Orthodox who are coalition partners and who very much do support the overhaul, saying to their followers, we don't want you going to the rallies.
And that brings us to the big question. Given that Israelis are so sharply divided about the kind of country they seem to want, how could this story play out? Not long ago, while the compromise talks with the opposition were happening, Netanyahu was telling Western media he wanted to get consensus on the reforms. Then the talks were off and the overhaul was back on. But then, at the end of June, there was a new twist.
Yes, he told the Wall Street Journal that he would scrap the override clause. What he actually meant is a bit murky because he later qualified the statement to say that he didn't mean an across-the-board shelving of that clause. He had come under pressure from coalition partners who objected to the statement, and he seemed to be trying to appease them. In any case, the legislation is not on the immediate legislative agenda.
As so many politicians do, Netanyahu was observed to adjust the message depending on who he was talking to.
So we see commentators saying that Netanyahu has been saying different things to the foreign media and domestic audiences about whether or not he's going to drop the override clause.
He's only said this in English. Let's hear him say it in Hebrew.
There also seems to be confusion in the Israeli media about what the government will do now.
There's a sense that there won't be a compromise, but at the same time, it's not clear how far the Prime Minister is willing to go. He has seen the force of the protest, the size of the protest, and there's a general feeling that he won't try to push through the original package again. It is possible that the public pressure will pare it down.
The one concrete thing the protests achieved, the pause for negotiations, does now seem to be in the past. Is pressure from Western governments likely to make any difference?
Prime Minister Netanyahu is definitely sensitive to responses abroad to what goes on in Israel, certainly in Washington. On recent trips abroad, the media has reported criticism that he's heard from leaders in Europe, particularly a public statement by U.S. President Biden in which he urged the Prime Minister to make changes only with broad consensus and was very emphatic when he was asked if he would be inviting Netanyahu anytime soon. The answer was no.
Like many strong supporters of Israel, I'm very concerned. And I'm concerned that they get this straight. They cannot continue down this road. And I've sort of made that clear. Hopefully, the Prime Minister will try to work out some genuine compromise, but that remains to be seen.
But again, he has to balance against right-wing, far-right parties in his coalition who are less concerned about that. As one minister put it, we're not the 51st state regarding the United States, so they don't dictate to us.
A question for both Joel and Shana. Are the protests changing the political culture inside Israel, or are they more of a sign of changes that were already happening?
I think that the crisis has definitely reawakened debate here on very fundamental issues of government and public policy. The recent Israeli elections have been marked by a kind of a paucity of real issues. It's basically been about Netanyahu, yes or no, or as it's been put here, yes, Bibi, or no, Bibi, using his nickname. Now we have a very interesting change in the public conversation where you have Israelis out on the streets on really substantive issues on which direction the country will go, what kind of government will it have, and what does Israeli democracy mean.
The crisis is definitely born out of a change, and that change is a polarization within Israeli society, a changing demographics, but it's also creating a change. And for a lot of people, maybe they voted for Netanyahu in the most recent elections, but they're starting to see him take more and more moves they see as anti-democratic, and they went out to protest in ways that they had never done.
Do you think there's any real risk that President Herzog's warning of civil war could come true?
I think that was dramatic language used at a particularly tense moment when the protests had flared on the streets and there were concerns that the country would be torn apart by this. But there's definitely a culture war going on. There are some descriptions of this as a fateful juncture for the country where it has to choose if it's going to uphold principles that the protesters point out were set out in Israel's Declaration of Independence to guarantee rights of all citizens, or is it going to take the direction of a state that gives priority to the Jewish part of a Jewish democratic state and gives that prominence over minorities and other groups? Certainly, there's a feeling that very weighty issues are at stake here about which direction Israel is going to take.
And here's a final, sobering thought from Shana.
I think this does definitely feel like a defining moment for Israel. And when it comes to the issue with the Palestinians, if Israel does go ahead with this overhaul, it takes the possibility of a peace deal, which even now with the current climate seems very far away, even further away and further off the agenda.
Thanks to Joel Greenberg, Shana Oppenheimer, and Dana Dula. The producer is Lucy Bailey. The sound engineer is Nigel Dix, and the editor is Judy King. And we'd love to hear from you. If there's a story you'd like to hear in future episodes, you can get in touch. Our email address is theglobaljigsaw, all one word, @bbc.co.uk. If you can, subscribe or follow The Global Jigsaw so you never miss an edition. That's it for now. I'm Krassi Twig. Thanks for listening.